Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's information session for childcare providers participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. My name is Julia Banks, and I am a communications manager in the Division of Early Learning at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, also known as OSSE. And today we'll be sharing information about updated monitoring requirements for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund for providers who participated in fiscal year 2024. Before we jump into the meeting, we want to take a few minutes to address housekeeping details and walk through some Zoom features. Please note today's session will be recorded and the recording will be sent to childcare providers following the session. So as you are likely familiar with from our previous information sessions, we're using Zoom webinar to conduct this session. Because we're in webinar mode, all attendees are automatically muted and your video is off. As usual, I'll highlight a few Zoom features. First are the language channels, which you can find by clicking the globe icon found on the bar at the bottom of your screen and highlighted on this slide in orange. In addition to offering today's session in English, there are Spanish and Amharic language channels set up. Please click the icon and select the language you would like to tune into. If you're on the English call, you should still click that EN button for the English call. I will now invite the moderators from the Spanish and Amharic language channels to provide instructions for individuals who would like to attend the session in one of those languages.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Hoy estamos ofreciendo interpretación al español. Si usted necesita escuchar esta sesión en español y está en una computadora, deberá seleccionar el canal de idioma. Aparecerá un icono parecido a un globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Debe seleccionarlo y después seleccionar español. Si está usted en una tablet o en un smartphone, debe hacer clic en los tres puntos de la parte inferior de la ventana de Zoom, después en interpretación de idiomas y después en español. Si no selecciona el idioma, no va a poder escuchar al intérprete durante la sesión. Voy a dejar estas instrucciones en el chat.
ጤና ይስጥልኝ እንደምን ዋላችሁ። ይህንን ስብሰባ በአማርኛ ትርጉም መከታተል ለምትፈልጉ ከስክሪኑ በታች ብርቱካናማዋን የዓለም ቅርጽ ያላትን በመምረጥ እንግሊዝኛ፣ አማርኛና ስፓኒሽ የሚል ምርጫ ታገኛላችሁ። አማርኛ የሚለውን በመንካት የአማርኛ ትርጉም መከታተል ትችላላችሁ። አገባቡ በታብሌትም በኮምፒውተርም ሆነ በስልካችሁ ለምትከታተሉ ተመሳሳይ ነው። መልካም ቀን፣ መልካም ስብሰባ።
Thank you to our Spanish and Amharic moderators for sharing those instructions. They were also included in the chat. Now let's walk through a few additional Zoom features. We'll use the chat feature highlighted on this screen with the green box throughout today's session to share links and other information with attendees to reference. Next is the leave meeting button highlighted on the screen in purple. If you need to leave the meeting early, you can just click that button. And then finally is the Q&A feature. If you have questions you'd like to ask during the session, please submit them using the Q&A. We'll go into a little bit more detail on how to use that feature on the next slide. So here is what the Q&A feature will look like on your screen. To submit a question, type it in the box seen here highlighted in red and then click submit. I'll note that we'll do our best to answer all the questions that come in. If you have questions that are not addressed during the meeting, please email osse.ecepayequity@dc.gov. Next, I'd like to share that in addition to the language channels, we also have the slides that we are presenting today translated in Spanish and Amharic. We dropped those in the chat just a bit ago, but I will do that once more just so folks can have them. These materials are also found on the OSSE website, and so we will drop a link to that webpage in the chat as well. Okay, so with that technical overview, I'll now introduce our speakers. This afternoon, you will hear from Hannah Matthews, Director of Policy Planning and Research in the Division of Early Learning at OSSE, and Angela Spinella, the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund Program Manager in the Division of Early Learning. Before I hand things over to Angela, I'll walk through our agenda and make a few important notes. We'll start out today's session with an overview and refresher about the fiscal year 2024 monitoring policy. We will discuss the updates made to the fiscal year 2024 monitoring policy in March 2025. The monitoring policy applies to all child care providers that participated in the Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 2024. We will then walk through how to submit monitoring documentation. And then finally, we will review the monitoring checklist tool that will assist providers to submit their monitoring documentation to OSSI. There will then be time for a Q&A before closing out. And with all of that, I will pass things over to Angela.
Great. Thank you, Julia. And hello to everyone joining today's call. As mentioned earlier, my name is Angela Spinella, and I am the Program Manager for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. To begin, we will start with a refresher of the monitoring policy for fiscal year 2024 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. We will drop a link in the chat to the monitoring policy. I would like to emphasize that today's presentation covers the monitoring process for fiscal year 2024, which is the previous year of the program, and applies only to providers that participated in the program during that fiscal year. OSSI has not yet started monitoring providers for compliance with their fiscal year 2025 agreement. If your business is newly participating in the Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 2025, this information is still important to know and can help you prepare for monitoring for fiscal year 2025 when it launches. But you do not need to take action at this time. Please feel free to submit questions during the presentation using the Q&A feature. As you know, in fiscal year 2024, OSSI distributed pay equity funds directly to child care development facilities to increase compensation for early educators through a child development facility payroll funding formula. OSSI is monitoring all providers that participated in the Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 2024. Participating child development facilities are being monitored for compliance with the minimum salary requirements and other requirements of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund Provider Agreement for fiscal year 2024. Child care providers who participated in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund program in fiscal year 2024 and who received payments between December 2023 and September 2024 are being monitored for compliance with the minimum salary requirements and other components as required by the provider agreement for fiscal year 2024. It is important to note that providers with approved waivers in fiscal year 2024 are being monitored for compliance with program and waiver requirements, but are not required to meet the minimum salaries established by OSSI for fiscal year 2024. OSSI is also monitoring the salaries and credentials of lead teachers and assistant teachers and associate home caregivers employed by participating providers at least annually through review of payroll and/or related documents and staff records that provide evidence of salaries or wages paid to eligible early educators. The monitoring timeline is based on when a provider entered into the program. All providers who participated in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 2024 are currently being monitored. Some providers have already received notices of compliance or notices of noncompliance and corrective action plans. OSSI has initiated monitoring for all providers who do not participate in the DC Child Care Subsidy Program and who participated in the Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 2024. OSSI notified non-subsidy providers who entered the program in Q1 and Q2 of fiscal year 2024 that they needed to complete monitoring in July 2024. OSSI notified non-subsidy providers who entered the program in Q3 and Q4 that they needed to complete monitoring starting in February 2025. Providers had 30 days from the date they were notified to submit the required documentation to OSSI. This winter, OSSI started monitoring subsidy providers that participated in the Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 2024 in coordination with monitoring for compliance with their provider agreement for subsidized child care services. Subsidized child care providers who are monitored by OSSI in Windows 1 and 2 have been receiving communication from Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund team about their compliance or non-compliance with the Pay Equity Fund program. All participating providers are required to submit supporting documentation for the period that is being monitored. On this slide, you'll find a table that specifies the time frame for which documentation must be submitted for each quarter. I would like to note here that Q1 of fiscal year 2024 was the period from October 1st through December 31st, 2023. However, because providers were not required to increase staff salaries until after they received their first payment, child care providers that received a payment in Q1 are monitored for compliance with salary requirements in the quarter following receipt of their payment. In this case, those dates are January 1st through March 31st, 2024. Child care providers are still required to submit documentation of salaries paid during the quarter they entered the program, but OSSI will not monitor compliance with minimum salaries prior to a provider's receipt of their first quarterly payment from the fund. This means that if you participated in Q1, you would have provided OSSI documentation of salaries paid between October 1st and December 31st, 2023, but those salaries will not be monitored for meeting the minimum salary requirements. I will talk about this documentation more on the next slide. All participating providers are required to submit the following documentation to meet fiscal reporting requirements. Staff salaries or wages reported in the Division of Early Learning Licensing Tool, also known as DELT, and aligned with the minimum salary requirements. You must also submit staff offer and hire letters or contracts that are signed, dated, and include salary information. Evidence of salaries or wages paid to staff, which may include payroll system documents, canceled checks made out to the employees, payroll tax documents, pay stubs, electronic bill payment, service documentation, or provider bank statements that show records of payroll transactions. Documentation must be submitted to OSSI for all teachers, assistant teachers, and associate home caregivers employed by the provider during the period of review. Documentation is also required for staff who were employed in an eligible staff type for any portion of the period being monitored and who had an approved staff record in DELT, regardless of whether they are included in the provider's quarterly awards statement. Home providers and expanded home providers who are self-employed do not need to provide documentation of their own wages or salaries, but do need to provide required documentation for any eligible employees, including associate home caregivers. All participating providers are also required to meet non-fiscal requirements. This includes participation in classroom observations and submitting data on enrollment and tuition. I'll provide more details on each of those pieces in the coming slides. All participating providers are required to participate in an observation as part of their Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund provider agreement. For providers with preschool age classrooms, that would mean participating in the classroom assessment scoring system, also known as class, observation, and for providers with infant and toddler classrooms, that would mean participating in an environment rating scale, also known as ERS, observation. Providers do not need to submit observation data directly to OSSI. As long as child care providers completed required surveys based on the age groups served in their license and observations based on setting and/or age groups served, OSSI will not find them non-compliant with requirements of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund based on the observation scores or use scores in any way to determine quarterly award payments. Providers who did not complete the scheduling survey or observations as required by the provider agreement will be found non-compliant. For enrollment data, providers must report to OSSI data on enrollment by age group for the month following receipt of the first award payment and the month following receipt of each quarterly award thereafter. Providers who do not track enrollment data by month or do not have enrollment data for previous months should indicate that in their submission, but must report current enrollment by age and group. And for tuition data, providers must report to OSSI data on the undiscounted current tuition rate by age group. A few important things to flag when it comes to reporting tuition data. First, the undiscounted tuition rate should not reflect sibling discounts, sliding fee scale application, lower rates continuing to be charged to parents who enrolled prior to a rate increase, or any other discounts the program provides to participating families. Second, programs may report tuition on an hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, or school year basis. Third, programs should report the tuition rate that would be charged for a child newly enrolling in the program for the first time in the current month, or at the next available enrollment opportunity as applicable. And finally, programs that do not enroll children continuously throughout the year should report the tuition rate that will be charged for a child enrolling at the next available enrollment opportunity. Now let's walk through some additional reporting requirements for providers with an approved waiver of the fiscal year 2024 minimum salary requirements. In addition to fiscal reporting requirements that I detailed just a few moments ago, providers who have an approved waiver are required to submit to OSSI a salary schedule describing the wages or salaries paid to eligible teachers or assistant teachers following the receipt of the first quarterly award. The minimum wages or salaries paid to teachers and assistant teachers must exceed those paid as of September 30th, 2023. And financial data and reports that demonstrate that quarterly awards were utilized solely for the following purposes: increasing wages or compensation of eligible teachers and assistant teachers, including associated payroll taxes, covering administrative costs associated with implementing the salary scales and meeting OSSI requirements related to the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund as outlined in the provider agreement, covering costs of health and other fringe benefits for early childhood educators and other child development facility employees. Providers with an approved waiver are also required to participate in technical assistance from DC Shared Services Business Alliance, also known as DCSSBA. Child care providers do not need to submit proof of participation and technical support from the DCSSBA directly to OSSI. The DCSSBA will report to OSSI the child development facilities that participated in technical assistance. OSSI uses authoritative data sources to assess accuracy, completeness, and compliance. This includes minimum required salaries for early educators and facilities participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund by role and credential. Staffing roles as indicated and approved in DELT. The highest credential of staff members as indicated with appropriate attachments and approved in DELT. Staff position changes documented by staff change forms and/or staff resignation or termination letters submitted in DELT, which must be signed and dated, and any other relevant policy guidance or documents published by OSSI for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund as appropriate. I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Hannah Matthews, who will talk about the updates to the fiscal year 2024 monitoring policy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela, and hello to everyone. Good afternoon. As Julia said, I'm Hannah Matthews. I'm the Director of Policy Planning and Research in the Division of Early Learning here at OSSI. And as Angela said, I will now walk through some of the changes to the monitoring policy that were most recently updated in March of 2025. So as we've mentioned, OSSI has made updates to the amended fiscal year 24 Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund monitoring policy based on implementation of monitoring to date. The policy was most recently amended in March. We have updated the policy to clarify tiers of compliance, appeals, exclusion and termination, and recoupments. These are all things that we are working on to improve as we've embarked on the monitoring this year. These updates do not change information that providers are required to report or the method for reporting. OSSI is reviewing the documentation that has been submitted and issuing monitoring findings to participating providers for fiscal year 2024. Based on our review, providers have been and will continue to be issued findings of compliance or non-compliance. Today, we're going to walk through what that means. Following the monitoring review, providers without a waiver will have demonstrated that the salaries paid to eligible educators met the minimum salary requirements and that they satisfactorily met the provisions of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund provider agreement with 100% compliance. Providers who are compliant with all of those program requirements will receive a compliance notice and no further action will be required. Providers with an approved waiver will be found compliant if salaries were higher for all eligible educators compared to the salaries that they were paid in by September 30th, 2023. And funds must have been spent in accordance with the waiver requirement and all other program requirements. Now, for those that receive a non-compliant finding, a provider will be found non-compliant if minimum salaries are unmet for some or all eligible educators. Providers will also be issued notices of non-compliance for the following areas: not maintaining up-to-date staff records in DELT, not submitting the required documentation on the timeline prescribed by OSSI, not completing the observation scheduling survey or not participating in observations for ERS or the class, or for not submitting enrollment and/or tuition data. Next slide, please. Okay. When issuing non-compliant findings, this is for providers with approved waivers. Non-compliance findings will be based on a failure to pay salaries that were higher than those paid on September 30th, 2023 for some or all eligible educators, failure to participate in technical assistance offered through an OSSI-approved technical assistance partner as required by the waiver, failure to spend funds in accordance with waiver requirements, failure to maintain up-to-date staff records in DELT, failure to provide required compliance and compensation documentation for all or some early childhood educators employed during the period under review, failure to complete the observation scheduling survey or failure to participate in the observation during the time period under review, or failure to submit enrollment and/or tuition data as requested. Non-compliant providers will be categorized into one of 3 tiers based on their compliance with the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund provider requirements related to eligible educators' compensation and staff records. There are 3 categories: substantial compliance, minimal compliance, and non-compliance. No compliance, excuse me. For substantial compliance, a provider is compliant with monitoring requirements for at least 90% of its eligible educators, or a provider is compliant with all fiscal reporting requirements, but is missing non-fiscal reporting criteria, meaning not completing a scheduled survey for class or ERS, or not submitting enrollment or tuition data. Minimal compliance is a provider who's compliant with monitoring requirements for less than 90% of its eligible educators. And the no compliance tier is a provider compliant with monitoring requirements for less than 90% of its eligible educators and has demonstrated no effort towards compliance, including a lack of response to communications from OSSI regarding monitoring. Non-compliant providers will be issued corrective action plans based on their compliance tiers. So let's take a closer look at each tier. We're going to start with substantial compliance. Remember, that's 90% compliant or above. A provider who has been found to have been substantially compliant, meaning they are at 90% compliance or above, must take actions outlined in their corrective action plan based on their compliance tier. A note for everyone that any reference to days in the corrective action plan means calendar days and is inclusive of weekends, holidays, or scheduled program closures. Providers must meet their single corrective action deadline by the next quarterly DELT closure date or within 45 days of receiving their corrective action plan, whichever is later. By the deadline, providers who are found to be out of compliance with the minimum salary requirements are required to submit a payroll back pay corrective action plan. Additionally, providers will need to provide evidence that salaries or wages now meet the minimum salary requirements by submitting the most recent payroll documentation. In the case of a provider with a waiver, non-compliance findings will mean that salaries were not higher for some or all, for some or all eligible educators. Providers with waivers will need to provide evidence that salaries or wages now meet the salary schedule approved by OSSI. Providers who are found to be out of compliance for other monitoring requirements must adhere to the corrective action plan deadline listed in their corrective action plans. Failure to comply with requirements of the corrective action plan within the deadline prescribed by OSSI will result in the following actions. First, mandatory participation in a technical assistance session with the monitoring team that must occur within 45 days of the issuance of the corrective action plan. The provider should schedule this technical assistance session through the link provided in the corrective action plan via Microsoft Bookings. If the provider does not participate in the session, a non-compliance notice will be issued, and the provider's non-compliance status will be identified on mychildcaredc.gov. If non-compliance were to persist for an additional 30 days, the provider may be excluded from participation in the next Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in the next fiscal year. Next slide, please. Now we're going to look at minimal compliance. A provider who is found to have been minimally compliant means that they are below 90% compliant and must take the actions outlined in their corrective action plan based on this compliance tier. Providers are required to meet their single corrective action deadline by the next quarterly DELT closure date or within 45 days of receiving their corrective action plan, whichever is later. For providers found to be minimally compliant, they must, excuse me, one minute, please. Okay. Providers, sorry, technical difficulties there. Okay. Providers must take the following actions. Submit a payroll back pay corrective action plan if minimum salaries have not been met, and provide evidence that salaries or wages now meet the minimum salaries by submitting the most recent payroll documentation. In the case of a provider with a waiver, non-compliance findings will mean that salaries were not higher for some or all eligible educators, and a back pay corrective action plan must be submitted along with evidence that salaries or wages now meet the salary schedule submitted by the provider and approved by OSSI. Providers must comply with all other monitoring compliance requirements cited in their corrective action plan. And finally, they must participate in a technical assistance session with the monitoring team within 45 days of receiving the corrective action plan to ensure that the provider understands why they have been found non-compliant and to understand the steps they must take to become into compliance. Again, this can be scheduled through the link provided in the corrective action plan via Microsoft Bookings. Attendance at a technical assistance session is mandatory for providers who are found to be minimally compliant. Next slide, please. Failure to comply with these requirements cited in the corrective action plan within the deadline allocated will result in the following actions. A non-compliance notice will be issued and the provider's non-compliance status will be identified on mychildcaredc.gov. If non-compliance persists for an additional 30 days, the provider may be excluded from participation in the Pay Equity Fund in the next fiscal year. Finally, no compliance. A provider who is found to have been completely non-compliant must take the actions outlined in their corrective action plan, which by the date given by OSSI. Providers in this tier are also required to meet their single corrective action deadline, again, by the next quarterly DELT closure date or within 45 days of receiving their corrective action plan, whichever is later. If a provider is found to be in the no compliance tier, that provider must do the following. They must submit a payroll back pay corrective action plan if minimum salaries have not been met, and provide evidence that salaries or wages now meet the minimum salary requirements by submitting their most recent payroll documentation. For providers with a waiver, non-compliance findings will mean that salaries were not higher for some or all eligible educators, and a back pay corrective action plan must be submitted, again, along with evidence that the salaries or wages now meet the salary schedule approved by OSSI. The provider must comply with other monitoring compliance requirements that are cited in their corrective action plan. The provider must also participate in a technical assistance session with the monitoring team within 45 days of receiving the corrective action plan. Providers who have demonstrated no compliance and fail to comply with the steps outlined in their corrective action plan will be issued a non-compliance notice, and the provider's non-compliance status will be identified on MyChildCareDC. The provider may be excluded from participation in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in the next fiscal year if the non-compliance persists for an additional 30 days. The providers may also be referred for recovery or collection means by OSSI in order to recoup funds that have not been accounted for in the monitoring process. If no compliance efforts are made by the provider by the corrective action deadline, or no documentation is provided related to the findings of noncompliance, OSSI will seek recoupment of any funds paid to the provider, and providers may be excluded or permanently barred from participation in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in the future. So I want to underscore here, this is for providers who have demonstrated no compliance and failed to communicate and provide information to OSSI. It's very important to do so. If a provider does not correct the noncompliance within the timeline designated by OSSI through the corrective action process identified in OSSI's monitoring policy, the provider will remain in their assigned noncompliance tier and be subject to increased monitoring. A provider who is found to be in a noncompliance tier and does not come into compliance within the timeline may be excluded from the program for 1 year or terminated from the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund permanently. Please note these consequences apply to all non-compliant provider tiers. Now I want to talk a little bit about the appeals process. Providers who are found to be non-compliant may appeal their determination. Appeals must be submitted using the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund non-compliance appeal form. We will share a link to the appeal form that can be found in the chat. The form must include supporting documentation to substantiate any non-compliance appeal. Appeals must be submitted within 7 business days from the date of the notice of noncompliance and corrective action plan was issued by OSSI. OSSI will review the appeal, including any related documents, follow up with the provider as needed, and make a determination to either approve or deny the appeal. OSSI will issue a determination in writing within 15 business days from the day the appeal was submitted by the provider. All appeal determinations will be approved by the Deputy Superintendent of Early Learning and are final. Should the provider fail to correct the noncompliance within the timeline designated by OSSI through the corrective action process, the provider will remain in their assigned noncompliance tier and be subject to increased monitoring. A provider who is found to be in a noncompliance tier and does not come into compliance within the timeline may be excluded from the program for 1 year or terminated from the program permanently. Providers do have the right to appeal a determination of exclusion from the program or termination from the program. And with that, now that we've reviewed the updates to the monitoring policy, I want to turn things back over to Angela to walk everyone through how to submit the monitoring documentation.
Great. Thank you, Hannah, for those updates to our monitoring policy. I am now going to walk us through the process for submitting documentation for monitoring for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. So OSSI is using 2 platforms to collect documentation for monitoring. We use the Division of Early Learning Licensing Tool, also known as DELT, and the Smartsheet. OSSI recognizes that using multiple platforms to submit required documentation may create an additional layer of complexity and work for our child care providers. We have selected these platforms in an effort to collect data efficiently, given the functionalities and limitations of the current DELT system, while also ensuring that all platforms used to collect data are secure and protect the privacy of personally identifiable information shared by child care providers about their businesses and staff. To support providers, we've created a chart here that you'll see on this slide that details the various documentation that must be submitted to OSSI and where it should be submitted. The chart also highlights documentation that all participating providers are required to submit and additional documentation that is only required to be submitted by providers with an approved waiver. Now I'm going to walk us through in DELT how to upload staff hiring letters and update salary types. So the first step is you will need to navigate to DELT's homepage, and you will need to log into your provider profile in DELT. You will then need to click No if you do not have a dc.gov or k12.dc.gov email account. You will then need to enter your email address or username and password and then click Sign in to sign into DELT. The next box you'll want to click on is the facility profile. Once you've clicked on the facility profile, you will then need to select the facility that you are trying to update using the pencil icon as seen here on this slide. After you have clicked the pencil icon, you will then need to click on the Staff tab as seen here in this screenshot. The next step in this process in the Staff tab is to click the pencil icon to edit an existing staff record. So you'll have to click on the staff record you want to update. There will probably be multiple staff records for those facilities that have more than one staff. You will then need to scroll down the page to the attachment section and click Browse, where you see staff qualification checklist with supporting documentation. That is where you will upload the staff hire letter or staff contract. Documentation must be uploaded as a PDF. File names must be clear and indicate their content. For example, John Doe offer letter.pdf. Please note that fields with a red asterisk are required to be completed. You will next want to scroll down in the staff record to the compensation section and select the correct salary type. So that might be annual or hourly. And then you will also need to enter the staff's email address. Again, fields with a red asterisk are required to be completed. You will then want to scroll to the bottom of the page. You'll click Save and Close. Please note that if you need to make updates after clicking Save and Close, you will need to contact aussie.childcarelicensing@dc.gov and specify the record you want to update. Now I'm going to demo for us the Smartsheet submission of enrollment and supporting payroll documentation of salaries. So I'm going to share my screen now for this portion. Okay. Hoping everyone can see that now that I'm sharing the Smartsheet form. What you'll need to do in this form is scroll down to the facility license number section right here and choose the drop-down arrow to find your facility and license number. This drop-down arrow right
Angela,
here.
we can't see your screen.
Oh, I'm so sorry. One moment. Okay, thank you. Let's try this again. Are we sharing now?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Julia. Okay, so again, what you'll want to do is access the Smartsheet link to submit your enrollment and tuition data here. And you're going to want to make sure that you choose your facility's license number and your name of the facility from the drop-down menu. Next, you're going to want to make sure that you are entering the enrollment data for the first month of each quarter the facility has been enrolled in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund to date. So you'll have a drop-down to select here. Facilities that don't track enrollment data by month or do not have enrollment data for prior months available can indicate that in the form and will not be penalized, but are required to report the current month of enrollment and will be required to report quarterly enrollment in the future. You'll also want to enter enrollment data for each of the following age groups that are applicable to your facility. As you can see, when I click the drop-down button, there are some boxes that appear based on the enrollment month. You'll want to list the number of children enrolled for the selected quarter by age group. If you do not serve one of the groups, you are not required to enter information into this group's field, and you should just leave it blank. As you can see, this is not a required field here, so you would not have to complete that if you did not serve that age group. As you are continuing on this form, you're also going to want to enter the tuition data for each applicable group that is served by your facility. You'll want to identify the frequency of the tuition rate reported for each group of children served at the facility. For example, daily, weekly, monthly, calendar year, or by school year. And that's going to be based on how your facility typically charges families tuition. Ensure that you complete each box that's relevant to your facility. You do not need to complete every box, but just the boxes that are relevant to your facility. So as you can see, there are not red asterisks here. Facilities that do not track tuition rates or do not have data on tuition rates for months available can indicate that in the form and will not be penalized, but are required to report current tuition as of the date the monitoring data is submitted, and will be required to report tuition on a quarterly basis in future fiscal years. Facilities are required to report the undiscounted tuition rate that would be charged for a newly enrolled child who is starting in the program the month the monitoring data is submitted. For example, if you are submitting monitoring data for a facility in July, you should report the rate you would charge for a child enrolling in July. This rate should not reflect sibling discounts, sliding fee scale application, lower rates continuing to be charged to parents who enrolled prior to a rate increase, or any other discounts the program provides to participating children and families. If the facility enrolls exclusively children whose parents are employed by a specific employer and charges a discounted rate for those children, report that rate. If the facility does not enroll children continuously throughout the year, report the tuition rate that would be charged for a child enrolling at the next available enrollment opportunity. Now going to scroll down to the payroll documentation for all providers section of the Smart Sheet. If your facility has an approved waiver, you must upload the additional fiscal and payroll documentations here as well. Multiple documents can be uploaded at the same time. Files can either be dragged and dropped into the Smart Sheet or uploaded from your computer of the person who is submitting the documentation. Once all required data and documentation has been submitted, you're going to want to click the Submit button to submit this information to OSSI. If you want a copy of your responses, which I highly recommend, you must select Send me a copy of my responses, and you'll have to add in your email address in this section. If you operate multiple facilities participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, a Smart Sheet form must be completed for each of those facilities. Again, I do recommend sending yourself a copy of those responses. So the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund also has a corrective action plan Smart Sheet, which has the same fields that I just reviewed, including enrollment data, tuition rates, and payroll documentation. Same as you would for enrollment and tuition data, you would definitely have to check your facility's license and name. And you're going to want to make sure that only the field or fields that you should be completing in the Smart Sheet are those that were cited in your business's corrective action plan. So those fields could include enrollment data, tuition data, payroll documentation, fiscal documentation for all providers with an approved waiver, and payroll documentation for providers with an approved waiver. Again, you're only going to want to submit documentation for those areas where your business was cited in your corrective action plan. You do not need to submit for every area again. And just as with the enrollment and tuition data form, if you operate multiple facilities, you must complete a form for each of the facilities that was cited in your business's corrective action plan. Okay, let me stop sharing my screen here. I will now share a separate screen, which I will walk through. Bear with me one moment here as I pull up my screen for our monitoring checklist for all of our providers that we have now published. Okay. Okay. I should be sharing with everyone the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund monitoring checklist. So we want to make sure that prior to submitting any of your monitoring documentation, you want to make sure you have completed the scheduling survey and any required observations from class or ERS. If you are a waiver provider, check that you have attended at least one technical assistance session with the DC Shared Services Business Alliance. Be sure that you are submitting clear and understandable payroll and supporting documentation. You should verify that all payroll documentation includes clear and understandable salaries or hourly wages for each of the eligible staff members for the quarter for which you are being monitored. If you do not submit payroll documentation that shows clear minimum salaries or hourly wages, you will be issued a finding of noncompliance until the payroll documentation demonstrates that the minimum hourly or salary requirements are being met. You may provide an explanation of your payroll documentation by submitting a Word document or PDF with information that provides additional background or context. You can submit that via the smart sheet that I was sharing just a few moments ago. You want to also confirm that you are submitting executed offer letters or contracts that include understandable annual salaries or hourly wages and are signed and dated by the staff member. If offer letters do not have the required elements, as required by your provider agreement, you will be issued a finding of noncompliance. When submitting information in DELT, ensure that salary information is entered in the staff's record for each eligible employee. Offer letters and/or contracts should be uploaded into the staff record under the educational qualifications section in DELT. If you are a provider with an approved waiver, be sure that you have submitted your business's salary schedule detailing the annual salaries or hourly wages paid to eligible staff members by role and credential. This salary schedule should be uploaded as an attachment under the facility profile page in DELT. When you submit payroll documentation in the smart sheet, ensure that you have included all enrollment and tuition data for each group that your business serves. You also want to ensure that you have uploaded the payroll documentation into the smart sheet for all eligible staff members for the quarter that is being monitored. If you are a provider with an approved waiver, you should also be submitting in the smart sheet the financial data or reports that show the quarterly awards were used solely for the purposes that are allowable by the waiver you were approved for. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and will allow Jarrett to share back the slide deck so that we can move into the Q&A portion of our session.
Thank you, Angela. Before we get into our Q&A, we're going to do a quick poll to see what language everyone is attending today's session. So if you can answer the question in the chat, please tell us what language you attended today's session in, and the options are English, Spanish, and Amharic. Okay, thank you for everyone who answered that poll question. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of today's meeting. Hannah and Angela, I will start off with some questions that we have from the Q&A. So the first one is, how will student enrollment and tuition data be used in the Pay Equity Fund? Can you provide more clarity on how this information is used?
Sure, I can take that one. Submitting enrollment and tuition data is a requirement of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund program. It's included in the provider agreement that providers sign. The enrollment and tuition data, OSSI will not report out individually on programs. That is our information for internal analysis, and some of the information may be reported collectively, but will not be shared information relative to a specific facility or provider. The tuition data is now used to inform our decisions about what providers meet the 90th percentile for childcare tuition rates. That is a relevant portion of the new funding formula that's in effect this fiscal year. Providers who charge tuition at or above the 90th percentile of the childcare market are ineligible for the administrative enhancement and the infant toddler equity adjustment portions of the child development funding facility funding formula. So the enrollment and tuition data is used for that purpose towards our analysis there. And again, the enrollment and tuition data also are used for our own information to be able to have a more informed perspective on our childcare facilities. One additional piece for those providers who submit requests for waivers of the minimum salary requirements, we do consider enrollment and again tuition data in reviewing and processing those waiver requests.
Thank you, Hannah. Our next question is, what salary should we submit? What the center paid or what the center paid with pay equity?
Sure, I can take that one, Julia. Thank you. Child care providers are required to pay eligible staff wages or salaries that meet or exceed the minimum salary requirements in a given fiscal year. I want to emphasize here that you must meet the minimum salary requirements through either hourly wages or annual salaries that are paid to the employees through their regular earnings or paychecks. So I'm not sure what exactly this question is getting at, but it should be the salary that's in the regular paycheck or earnings of the staff at that facility that is participating in the Pay Equity Fund. Any bonuses or quarterly supplemental payments are not allowable methods for meeting the minimum salary requirements.
Thanks, Angela. Our next question is, on the Smart Sheet, we upload the payroll documents, and on DELT, we upload the contract letter for each staff. Is that correct?
That is correct. So the staff offer letter should be uploaded in DELT. When I did the walkthrough sharing the screenshots, it will be uploaded in the staff qualifications section. The payroll documentation should be submitted via the Smart Sheet so that it can be submitted all at once for each staff.
And I believe we have a chart that breaks down where each piece is uploaded. That might be useful to go back to.
Yes, thank you, Julia.
There we go.
Actually, I'll just take a second so that we could actually walk through this. So ensure that your staff salary wages, that's just the actual hourly amount that you're paying. So for instance, a teacher with a CDA for this fiscal year, it would be $24.52 an hour. That would get reported in DELT. A staff offer or hire letter gets uploaded into DELT as well. And then the evidence of what you're paying that staff gets uploaded to the Smart Sheet. For providers who have an approved waiver, you're also going to want to make sure you get that salary schedule uploaded into the Smart Sheet, along with any other financial or fiscal data that you have demonstrating how you spent the award. This is for all providers, anything related to the non-fiscal reporting requirements, including enrollment, tuition, and observation. Specifically, enrollment and tuition data gets collected in the Smart Sheet. And observations, there's no action required on the providers. That is information that we get from another team within OSSI. And then same with participation in the DC SSBA technical assistance for waiver providers. That information is also shared with a team at OSSI, with our team.
All right, our next question is from someone, it sounds like they already submitted their initial monitoring. They said, what happens if there is a facility that already submitted monitoring data prior to attending this training and was not aware of all the components for compliance?
I would strongly encourage that facility to schedule office hours with our team. If you have an open corrective action plan, that means that you still have elements that are non-compliant with our Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund agreement, and we would be happy to walk through with that facility any of the outstanding items in a corrective action plan. If the question is, will you be penalized or anything like that, we're just continuing to issue corrective action plans at this point. If you are in communication with us, as Hannah outlined, you are not in that no compliance tier. So just email ossi.ecepayequity@dc.gov. We can give you the link to office hours. We'd love to talk more about your corrective action plan specifically.
Our next question is about the tuition rate. So it says, we would like to confirm, is the tuition rate the regular subsidy rate, the parent fee, or for the private paying rate?
We are asking for the undiscounted tuition rate charged to private pay families. So we are looking for the amount that you would charge to a parent without any discounts, like a sibling discount or anything else. We want to know what the undiscounted private pay tuition rate is.
Thanks, Hannah. Our next question is, what are the deadlines for quarterly compliance to be completed?
So we don't have quarterly compliance deadlines as of right now. We are, as outlined in our presentation above, we are monitoring all providers for their compliance with the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. For our non-subsidy providers, for quarters 1 and 2, they would have been notified in July of 2024. For our non-subsidy providers who entered in quarters 3 and 4, they were notified about monitoring in February. And then this winter and into the spring, we've been working with our subsidy team on those providers who have been monitored in the subsidy windows. So when you are issued a corrective action plan, you are issued a timeline specific to your facility. And so when it's usually 45 days, the first corrective action plan is 45 days from the date of the corrective action plan that it was issued. And so as of right now, we don't have quarterly deadlines established, but we are working with all providers in fiscal year 2024 to ensure compliance with the program requirements.
Thanks, Angela. And a question that is popping up a lot in the chat is folks asking for the link to the smart sheet. And I think it's important to note here that you do not need to complete the smart sheet every quarter. Angela and her team will be notifying providers when it is time to complete monitoring via email, and you will receive the link then. So if you're not sure if you need to be completing monitoring right now, reach out to the Pay Equity Fund team at aussie.ece payequity@dc.gov, and they can help you sort that out. Let's see. Our next question sounds like someone might be having trouble uploading documents. It said, I was in the second monitoring, but don't believe I have received any notifications about non-compliance. Although I have the necessary documents, I had a problem uploading documents at the time. Can you speak to how to contact someone about possible deficiencies?
Sure. If you believe that you have been non-compliant with the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, you should have received both via DELT messaging and also from our Pay Equity Fund inbox. You would have received an email with a link to your corrective action plan along with the notice of non-compliance. So if you did not get that notice, you do not believe you got it, or you think you have some deficiencies that you need to speak to our team about, I would just encourage you to email our inbox, aussie.ece payequity@dc.gov, or sign up for office hours to meet with our team because you should have received communication if you were non-compliant with our requirements.
Let's see. Our next question here, someone said, can you unlock the tab in DELT to submit the letter for salaries? It's currently closed. Angela or Hannah, could you speak a little bit to how DELT is closed at the moment and what folks should do?
Yes, so DELT closed for all of our providers on April 30th. That was the last day. April 30th at 5 p.m. was the last day to update staff records. So at this time, we cannot, and you will not be able to do anything related to an upload for staff offer letters, or you also won't be able to edit the record for any kind of wages or salaries that you want to put into that staff's record. I will say, if you are concerned about meeting your corrective action timeline, if you are out, if your deadline's coming up and DELT is closed, again, just reach out to our team. We have been having phone calls and conversations and meetings with providers who have had issues with their corrective action plans, issues in DELT. We've walked through, we've done screen shares. So I would strongly encourage you to reach out to our team, again, via the Pay Equity inbox or scheduling office hours.
Our next question says, when do things need to be submitted by? Is it annually? Angela, Hannah, could you just talk a little bit more about the timeline and when folks actually need to complete monitoring?
So I want to differentiate between monitoring and the program requirements. You should be updating staff records on a quarterly basis. That is part of your provider agreement. So any updates to a staff record should be happening on a quarterly basis by the deadlines established by OSSI. So that is something I really want to emphasize here, is that you should not wait until we are reaching out to you with a corrective action plan. You should be consistently updating your staff records, not just for program requirements for the Pay Equity Fund, but also for any of the licensing requirements that you need to fulfill. So I just want to emphasize that here. If you have a deadline for your corrective action plan, that will be outlined individually in your corrective action plan, the date that it was issued. The first time you are issued a corrective action plan, it is 45 days. The second time you're given 30 days. So you have a little bit less time because we are trying to get the corrective action plan closed. So I just want to emphasize, related to monitoring, yes, we are monitoring for the program requirements, but you are required as part of your provider agreement to update staff records on a quarterly basis.
Thanks, Angela. I see a question here that is about how a facility or a provider's award is calculated. We are going to use this time to focus on our monitoring focus question. So I'd say if you have questions related to how the formula works, I encourage you to sign up for office hour appointment, and the pay equity team can help walk you through that. So I'll share that link. Another question related to monitoring. This person said, I used the smart sheet last time and I could see my results on the copy that was sent to me, but my monitor could not see all results. Is it possible that would happen again?
No, I haven't heard that issue. Thanks for bringing that up. If your monitor is unable to see what you're submitting in the smart sheet, that sounds like a technical issue that we may have been having on our side. So I do apologize for that. That should not be happening again, especially if you do have the proof that you submitted in the smart sheet. We are able to see what you submitted via the smart sheet, and unless there was some kind of technical glitch that was happening on that day, which we've had, I would say not that many, but a handful of people who have lost some things that they've submitted. But by and large, that should not be happening. So please let our team know so that we can, especially me, let me know that that's happening, because that should not be. We should be able to see what you submit.
Our next question is the pay based solely on the pay scale at the beginning of entry into pay equity, or will the payment be based on the years of service at the site? So I think this person is asking if there's any factoring of years of experience in the amount of the award payment.
So OSSI has the minimum salary requirements that we have put out for both fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025. Providers are required to pay those minimum salaries. If the provider wants to pay more than the minimum required salary based on years of experience, that is at the provider's discretion.
And we will drop a link to the funding formula in the chat for everyone. Let's see, our next question here. If we have a corrective action plan for wages that was given to us and they said the pay equity team will reach out to us, should we contact you or will the pay equity team contact the facility?
So if you've received a corrective action plan for what sounds to me like is potentially back pay, you're saying wages, it could be back pay. You are to submit a back pay plan via the smart sheet. If you need to meet with our team to discuss when you will be submitting the back payment plan for the staff that were outlined in your corrective action plan, you can certainly do that. Again, we have office hours each week on Wednesdays and Thursdays. On Wednesdays, it's from 11 to 1. On Thursdays, it's from 1 to 3. And we do meet with providers to review their corrective action plan. So if you have any questions about a potential back payment plan that needs to be submitted to us, we do not outline that for providers. We do not give specific requirements related to a back payment plan. We do look at what you submit. And then, we have a conversation, we either accept it or, we reach out again. So if you want to speak with our team, feel free to send us an email or schedule time to meet with us. We do virtual office hours, again, on Wednesdays and Thursdays every week.
Thanks, Angela. Another question here. I understand the smart sheet link will be sent when needed. Does this mean we don't need to upload documents to DELT, such as the requirement on the current screen, until we get the smart sheet?
Again, you are required to keep staff records up to date each quarter by the deadline that OSSI has prescribed. That's part of your provider agreement. Related to the payroll documentation, you are not required to submit that in the smart sheet until you are notified that you're being monitored. Again, most of the providers are in the monitoring at this point. We're working with our subsidy team on the remaining subsidy providers. All non-subsidy providers with OSSI have been monitored. And so you do not need to submit payroll documentation until it's time for you to be monitored. But again, related to staff salaries and wages and offer and hire letters, those are things you should be doing on a quarterly basis as things are changing with staff.
Our next question, how would you handle a teacher that also helps out with administrative functions? And I may want to pay them a little extra. So there would be So there may be a different pay than the $24.50. How would I document that?
So again, OSSI has put out the requirements for the minimum salary and hourly wages for staff. It is up to the provider's discretion if they want to pay that staff member more, and how you want to document that in their earnings is also at your discretion. OSSI requires that you meet the minimum salary or hourly requirements as designated for, if you're being monitored for fiscal year 2024, it would have been those minimum salaries for that fiscal year. Those have changed slightly in fiscal year 2025. But again, you have to meet the minimum salaries.
Let's see. Our next question. If you offer new employees a tentative offer until they meet certain requirements before they are an official employee, will this information be okay to submit if the employee is terminated or resigned before they became an official employee? So it sounds like they're asking if you need to submit information for people who have tentative offers.
So you have to submit monitoring documentation for any staff member who has an approved record in DELT, and also any staff record who would have been eligible for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. They would have been an eligible staff type, so that's a teacher or an assistant teacher. You would want to make sure that you submit that information for that staff member who has an approved record in DELT. If they don't have an approved record in DELT, that would be something that we wouldn't be able to look at, because we go by what's in DELT. Everything that we monitor is in DELT.
Our next question is, if someone does not meet the credential requirements for pay equity, do they hinder our participation in the program? So for instance, if a educator does not hold a CDA, might that impact a program's ability to participate in the pay equity fund?
Right. So when we calculate quarterly the awards for facilities, it's based on the eligible educators in the facility. We recognize that many facilities employ additional staff persons who are not eligible educators, either because they don't have a required credential if they're an assistant teacher or an associate caregiver or a lead teacher. We also recognize that there are employees in staff types and roles that are not included as eligible educators, so substitutes, other staff positions. So a provider may participate in the Pay Equity Fund program as long as they have eligible educators, and those eligible educators, their staff records will be the basis for the calculation of the facility's quarterly award. So we understand there will be educators who don't necessarily meet the requirements of the program.
We had a comment in the chat that says, have you considered the burden this places on providers creating an additional reporting mechanism to send the same documentation to OSSI as is in DELT? And I just want to reiterate what Angela said earlier, that we do recognize that using multiple platforms does create an additional layer of complexity for our childcare providers. We appreciate all the effort that you all are putting in to submit this documentation and maintain compliance. We are using these platforms in an effort to collect data efficiently, and given the functionalities and limitations of the current DELT system, we want to ensure that we are using platforms that are secure and protect your privacy. So again, we appreciate your patience and support as we work to complete the monitoring process. Another question here says, I see that one of my staff members' salary is blank in DELT. How do I fix that?
Right. So you will not be able to fix that until DELT reopens for providers. That will be at some point, probably the first week in June. you must update staff records by the quarterly deadlines that we prescribed. The last deadline for this quarter was April 30th at 5 p.m. So you will not be able to make any edits to staff salaries or wages at this time, or anything in staff records for that matter.
We have someone say, so if we upload the offer letter and staff qualifications in DELT, it will bump out the staff qualification documentation that may already be there. Is that going to be a problem when someone reviews documentation of credentials?
I think what you're saying is when you upload an offer letter, then you go to upload possibly the staff qualifications, that it is bumping out the previously uploaded document. If you are having issues like that, you want to let us know, or your licensing specialist know, if it's related to information that they need, because I do believe that that could be possibly like a DELT issue you may be experiencing. And so I want to make sure that you're not bumping out any required information from anybody who is asking for information from OSSI.
Thank you, Angela. And this will be our last question as we prepare to close things out. They said, I'm confused. When should we be submitting data into the spreadsheet for enrollment, et cetera?
Okay, so again, we have this slide listed here showing you when to submit for the different reporting requirements: staff salaries and wages, staff offer letters and hire letters. Those have to be submitted in DELT. You will not be able to do that at the moment because DELT is locked for providers, as licensing is reviewing staff records and approving staff records, or reaching out to facilities if they need additional information to approve staff records. And so you'll want to make sure that that information, you can gather that now, and when DELT reopens, you'll be able to do that. You'll be able to upload that documentation in June. There are other reporting requirements that we require you to upload in the Smart Sheet. That is the payroll documentation, which shows the wages or salaries that you've paid to staff. Those should be the minimum salary requirements that OSSI has prescribed. If you are a waiver provider, you will need to submit a salary schedule and also any fiscal documentation that shows how you spent the award. And then finally, for all providers, you have to submit enrollment and tuition data via the Smart Sheet. And if you still have further confusion, I strongly encourage anybody who has questions, concerns, to reach out to our team, OSSI.ece pay equity at dc.gov. And then also we have office hours, as I mentioned before. We would love to see you.
Thank you, Angela and Hannah. For folks with any outstanding questions, again, we encourage you to contact the Pay Equity Fund team via email. You can do that by sending an email to ossi.payequity@dc.gov. You can also sign up for virtual office hours. So with that, we will close things out. Thank you everyone who attended today's information session. We will drop a link in the chat to where you can find more information on the Pay Equity Fund. We also encourage you to check out the resources that were shared during today's session. That includes the monitoring policy and a guide for completing the updated monitoring process. And then finally, again, for questions, you can email ossi.ece payequity@dc.gov. As a reminder, we will be sharing out a recording of this presentation in the next week or so, so please be on the lookout for that. And thank you again for everyone who attended today.